I believe this court, by behaving that way, has created an unimaginable constitutional crisis. But acting on that belief is almost as dangerous as pretending it isn't true. I mean, imagine, Kate, if the next president says the government will enforce the Voting Rights Act, period, and that Congress shouldn't seat anyone coming from an illegal district. That is a fair consequence of their decisions, um, but a really dangerous one. If that's not the law you think they got egregiously wrong, we will enforce the McCain-Feingold Act and not let billionaires pour money into campaigns, period. And if they do, we will prosecute them as if Citizens United didn't exist. I mean, we are on the edge of that fight. So I guess I want to ask you, because I used to be a very lonely man in arguing for Supreme Court reform. Now I can barely get into the room. There are a lot of people who have said this is just crazy. So what do you think? What reforms are possible now? And so talk about a couple of them, and what kind of courage will it take to get them done, and how do those of us who aren't in office help them find that courage?
Right. So I think right now the reforms that have the most traction, kind of both from, a smattering of Democratic politicians and then some academics and activists on the left are, court packing, court expansion, term limits, and then jurisdiction stripping. And some of these, the idea is to, combine multiple. But I'm sure you've noticed in recent weeks, it feels like there's been some coalescing around the court packing idea, even from Democrats, particularly potential 28 hopefuls that you wouldn't usually associate with the wing of the party that is more amenable to, radical structural reform. And, that's Kamala Harris, you have Ruben Gallego, you have kind of normie Dems embracing this. And I think the court packing idea has gained such traction because we definitely know it's constitutional, right? Congress has done this a bunch before, changed the size of the court. And it's something that you could theoretically do right away. A trifecta sweeps in 28, the Democratic Congress and president put up new justices and bam, right? It happens right away. But the go ahead.
No, so just so people understand, the packing word just means expand the size of the court. Right. And traditionally, the courts have for a lot of American history, there have been the same number of Supreme Court justices as federal judicial districts. That would be 13 now. Mm-hmm. So we haven't expanded the court as we've expanded the judiciary.
Right. And there have been long calls to, expand lower courts as well, that their workloads have become big. This was not really a controversial idea until recently when you apply it to the Supreme Court. And to be clear, Republican states have done, quote unquote, court packing very recently. Utah, Arizona, and Georgia all expanded their courts by 2 seats in order to lock in right-wing majorities. So even though...
Oh, I didn't know that. Say that again. Yeah. Utah,
Arizona, and Georgia. Utah has happened because their Supreme Court was kind of dutifully enforcing this voter-passed restriction on partisan gerrymandering, and the legislature got fed up with that. So they said, let's expand it, put 2 partisans on. That'll be enough to get our maps through. And then Georgia and Arizona in the 2016 cycle both had concerns that their governor's mansion was getting more competitive. So they were like, you know what, let's lock in these right-wing majorities now before we have to worry about it. Which obviously is still, that's a huge cloud looming over all of these kind of potential statewide midterm battles, right? We're always like, Democrats have to commit to winning state Supreme Courts. Right. But Republicans have already kind of structurally cheated to make that much harder to achieve in a couple of these swing states.
I'm up here in Chicago. I was very much part of the fights to transition the Wisconsin Supreme Court from a completely partisan mess to an actual court. And that was a big fight. Mm-hmm. And the good people of Wisconsin took it seriously and have delivered now multiple times in a row to make it happen.
Yeah,
but it's hard. It's a hard fight.
And it's a harder fight when, Republicans keep changing the rules to give themselves an advantage, right?
Okay, so one of the reforms that you talked about, expand the court.
Yep.
Got it.
Okay, 2 is term limits. And now this one has some more kind of constitutional fighting about it, right? Because the Constitution guarantees that the justices can serve, while they're exhibiting
good behavior.
behavior. And that has long been interpreted to mean that's a lifetime appointment absent, impeachable acts. But there have been some academics, the Brennan Center has kind of been out front on this, who kind of devised a workaround that wouldn't require a constitutional amendment, because obviously we're not living in a world where a constitutional amendment is viable. And they say you can do this through a statute if you give the justices 18 years to serve on the bench, and then you put them on senior status.
Right.
Yep. And then they ride the lower circuits, which is kind of more similar to how the Supreme Court used to look. And that the leading bill to do that is called the Term Act, which the someone at the Brennan Center told me this week has just kind of been lit on fire these past couple of weeks with all the co-sponsors they're getting from members. And that would take effect right away. So Clarence Thomas would be first up.
Let me say that differently. They get a lifetime appointment. Absolutely. We're not saying they don't get a lifetime appointment, but that lifetime appointment is 18 years on the Supreme Court and the rest of their life as part of the federal judiciary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the thing with both court expansion and term limits, though, you're going to have to pass a law to do that. And then the question comes, well, how do you stop the current court from just striking it down, right? Even court expansion, which is so blatantly constitutional, does anyone have a lot of faith that this court would kind of willingly decrease their own power in the name of upholding the clear meaning of the text of the Constitution? So there have been some ideas floating around that would involve this idea of jurisdiction stripping, which is also very clear in the Constitution. Congress gets to do. It gets to decide the jurisdiction the Supreme Court presides over.
Called the exception clause.
Right. That maybe you can insert that into, say, the law establishing term limits, and say, and the court doesn't get to touch this law, right? We're passing this law and it's not in their jurisdiction. And Democrats have kind of toyed with this already in a different law called the No Kings Act, which hasn't gotten any traction because it's been, Republican government, but that would block the court from hearing cases about presidents' criminal acts, right? To try to defang the immunity ruling. So this idea is already in the ether.
Well, these are good ideas. I mean, I note that this is not new that we've needed Supreme Court reform. When Joe Biden first was elected, we talked about this, and he put in place a commission that was meant to float the ideas that would later lead to court reform. They recommended none of the things. They couldn't agree on any of them, but they floated some very interesting ideas, including some of the ones that you mentioned here.
That's right. And I think the problem there was Democrats had started to recognize that this Supreme Court is just untenable, right? That it, aside from the kind of stripping of civil rights, you also just have it acting as a legislative veto for Democratic administrations and a hall pass for Republican ones. And this was particularly pertinent when Biden took office and had his trifecta, and every corner of the left was kind of coming forward with their issue that they wanted him to act on, whether it be, democracy reform, environmental protections, abortion protections, right? And the concern was this court is not going to let any of that through, even if you do the gargantuan work of getting it through Congress when you have, the thinnest of majorities in the Senate and you've got Manchin in your caucus. But he was perhaps not the president to do it. Maybe the rest of these institutionalists in Congress just were not fire-breathing enough that we had this commission. They had great, intellectuals on it, great ideas, and it never really went anywhere, right? They wrote a report and then it just kind of petered out from there.
Yeah, I don't think I think I liked Joe Biden. I think some of the things he did were great. But I think they fundamentally failed because Joe himself said the biggest threat to the country was Donald Trump. And then he didn't act on it. He did nothing to protect us from this resurgent MAGA anti-democratic and a small d democratic
Mhm.
or autocratic movement that is caused these constitutional. I'm sorry, my dog is making some noise. I apologize.
He agrees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
No,
right.
I
So
think I
go
was just
ahead.
going to add, I think that's totally right. And the concern now is I've been doing reporting around all these reforms, which gets to your question about, the courage Democrats would need. Is the concern to me is, let's say the planets align. Democrats sweep into a trifecta in 28 with numbers to abolish the filibuster and requisite majorities to actually, get things through Congress. Then they are going to be so sorely tempted by this kind of Joe Biden playbook of, well, what if we do Medicaid expansion, right? What if we do affordability stuff, like the popular stuff, because we know that people just don't get that on fire about democracy reform, and doing the court reforms would be hard, right? And the right-wing media and the mainstream media and Republicans would accuse them of, kind of a dictatorial takeover. And what if they decide that's too hard, we're going to do this kind of bread and butter affordability stuff? Then we're in a world where you still have to abide under this Supreme Court. How much of
And
that agenda will stand?
that world doesn't exist. You cannot. This Supreme Court destroyed the Voting Rights Act. This Supreme Court got rid of campaign finance from it nullifies the laws that it nullifies laws that the people of America wanted. And these are bipartisan laws that were very, very important to the country, and they just nullified them because they could. It's untenable. It can't stand. But the Democrats have got to be able to do two things, right? You can do this government reform and you can help on the other agenda, which is also enormously important to lift our lives. I mean, I know Donald Trump is doing everything all at once. It's not as hard for him because it's much easier to destroy stuff than to build stuff. But the nation's at stake. We need leaders who can do it. So from the outside, it's our job to both cheer them on and to kick them forward if they get scared, right? I mean, I feel like, I'm Joe Stalin and I want to stand behind our troops and say, if you turn around and retreat, you're going to get shot. So move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think a lot of this, in terms of the outside pressure, will depend on who the 28 Democratic nominee is, right? Because most members of Congress take their cues from the White House, right? And that person's appetite for reform will just do huge work in bleeding down to the rest of the Democrats you'll need to act.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I do not believe a candidate will emerge from the primary who isn't willing to tackle the government reforms we need. I think
Yeah.
the public understands that, and I think that the connection has to be made between small d democratic reforms and a government that actually does its job for people. Because when you've broken the democracy, as these guys have, and we have these constitutional problems that we have, you end up with a government that works for the oligarchs. You end up with a completely for sale administration that says, oh, I'm going to sign a crypto bill. No, wait, I'm not going to. I just got to check. Wait, I'm going to do something about data, AI. No, I'm not. I just got to check. Oh, wait, I'm going to go to war in Iran because the oil companies want it and they get huge windfalls, right? That's what happens when the democracy is broken. So our candidates have to make the case that progress for the American people and progress for American democracy are the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a case I've heard made very often by candidates, but maybe this time.
Yeah, it's going to have to. And I think they're just going to have to figure out a different way to package it. And I think the way that you propose is smart, right? Like, give people the tangible benefits they want and say, we have to do this to get that, right? It's not about an abstract kind of pro-democracy argument. It's about, if you want the bread and butter stuff, we have to do the reforms first.
Right. Absolutely.